Pretend you're my wife tonight." The words landed at the nape of Lynette Vaughn's neck, quiet enough that the quartet in the far corner nearly buried them, near enough that she felt the warmth of the breath that carried them. She was balancing a tray of champagne. She had walked the whole length of the amber hall without losing a single glass, which was in itself a small triumph. Now a hand had folded around her free wrist. Not hard, only certain. She turned. The most dangerous man in Saltmere was looking down at her, as though they had loved each other for a decade. Lynette had been a hired server in the Callias household for exactly 9 days. When Severin Callias kissed her in front of half the city, she did not have time to refuse. She barely had time to set the tray on the marble ledge beside her before his other hand rose to her jaw, warm and unhurried, and his mouth found hers. The ballroom, which a breath before had been 300 people talking over one another beneath a ceiling of amber glass, went strangely soft, as though someone had closed a heavy door on all that noise. She noticed small, absurd things. The salt of the harbor that clung to everyone in this city, even the rich ones. The cool of a signet ring against her cheek. The fact that he was not truly kissing her so much as allowing the room to watch him choose to. When he drew back, only far enough to speak, his eyes held hers and his voice stayed beneath the music. "Smile," he said, "as though I have just told you something no one else is permitted to hear." She smiled. She never afterward understood why she obeyed so quickly. Somewhere to her left, a glass had stopped halfway to a mouth. A woman in pale green had gone very still. "There," he murmured, "that has just saved both our lives. Try not to look so astonished that you are still breathing." Across the floor, a silver-haired man in a sash, heavy with small decorations, had turned to watch them, and the woman in green had turned with him. This was the part Lynette would understand only later. That she had been standing in precisely the wrong square of floor, at precisely the moment Severin Callias required a wife, and that the entire glittering machinery of the evening had been assembled to marry him to someone else. The woman in green was named Vesna Corte. Lynette did not know that yet. She knew only that the stranger looked at her the way a person looks at a stain that has appeared on something they were about to purchase. "Callias," the silver-haired man called, crossing the floor with the ease of someone accustomed to rooms opening in front of him. "You have been keeping something from us." "I keep a great many things from you, Court," Severin said. "It is the reason we still do business." The old man stopped an arm's length away. His eyes moved over Lynette, with a slow, appraising rudeness, taking in the plain black of her serving dress, the risoled shoes, the absence of a single jewel. "And this one has a name," he said. "This wife, I have somehow never heard of." "She has," Severin answered, "though I admit I enjoy watching other men fail to earn it." The silence swung toward Lynette like a lamp turned suddenly on her face. She was a woman who dropped trays when she was watched. Everyone from her old life would have wagered their savings on her dropping this moment too, on the tremor climbing into her hands, on the apology already forming in her throat. Instead, she heard her own voice, steady and low. "Lynette," she said, "only that." She let it rest in the air the way her grandmother had once taught her to let a single note rest at the close of a phrase so that the ear leaned in for whatever came next and was made, gently, to wait. "The rest of it," she said, "he prefers to keep for himself." Corte laughed, charmed against his own will. Vesna Corte did not laugh at all. Later, Lynette would learn the full shape of the trap she had wandered into. That the Corte family held the western docks the way the Callias family held the eastern ones, and that the two houses had spent 20 years grinding each other down over the strip of black water between. That the marriage the whole city had gathered to toast was meant to fold Vesna Corte into the house on Cormoran Head and end the war. And that Severin Callias, who had agreed to it in some worn-out season of his life, had decided, somewhere in the hour before a woman crossed his path with a tray of champagne, that he would sooner set the harbor alight than sign himself into a treaty wearing a wedding ring. 9 days before that kiss, Lynette had stood at the service door of Kelly's house in shoes she had mended with her own hands, holding a slip of paper from an agency that supplied temporary staff to houses where no one ever learned the names of the people who carried the trays. She had come to Saltmere the way people come to harbor cities, because the water is at your back and there is nowhere further to run. She had left a marriage in the last city. She did not speak of it. Emmerich Dane had been the sort of man who corrected the way she breathed and called it care, who sat in the front row of every recital not to hear her play, but to be waiting, afterward, with the one wrong note she had missed and he had not. By the end she had trembled before she touched the keys. A pianist with shaking hands is a joke that tells itself. She had stopped performing. She had stopped, for a long while, believing the hands were hers. There was an envelope now, folded inside a book she never opened in front of anyone, and in the envelope was money she added to a little at a time, a fund for an audition she was still too frightened to book. 9 days of carrying other people's champagne had put 3 more notes inside it. She had taken the Callias work, because it paid double, and asked nothing of her but silence and a steady tray. The house on Cormoran Head had felt, from the first evening, like a place holding its breath. The staff spoke in the low tones of people near a sick room. There was, she had gathered, a child somewhere in the tall, cold rooms. No one said much about the girl. What little Lynette had gathered, she had gathered the way servants gather everything, in fragments over the noise of the pans. That the master's sister had died the winter before, and left him a daughter. That the daughter had gone silent. That the tall, cold rooms of Collia's house had arranged themselves around that silence the way a splint arranges itself around a break, and that no amount of the family's money had yet coaxed a single word back out of the child. Back in the amber light of the ballroom, Severin's hand closed again around Lynette's, and this time she felt it was not for the room. This time it was a warning. "Walk with me," he said, still smiling for the crowd. "Do not let go of my hand. And do not, whatever else you do tonight, tell that man the truth." "Which truth?" she said. "Any of them," he said. "You have just married the most hated man in Saltmere. By morning, everyone who wants me dead will know your face." He steered her out of the ballroom through a side door most of the guests had not noticed, into a corridor where the music thinned to a rumor. Only there did he release her hand. "You are not going to faint," he said. "I don't faint," Lynette said. "I drop things. Fainting looks tragic. Dropping things only looks like me." He studied her, and she watched him revise some estimate he had made when he gambled his whole evening on a stranger's nerve. "You held the note," he said. "The what?" "Your name. You gave Corda one word and made him wait for the second. Most people fill a silence like that, with everything they own. You let it work for you." Where does a caterer's assistant learn that? Before she could decide how much of herself to hand a stranger, a sound reached them from further down the corridor. Not a cry. Something worse than a cry, because it was trying so hard to be quiet. A thin, held breathing, the sound of a person drowning in a room with plenty of air. A door stood half open on a small library. Inside, a woman in a nurse's gray crouched over a little girl and got nowhere, her voice bright and false. The child was perhaps 6 years old, backed into the narrow space between a bookshelf and the cold hearth, knees drawn up, both hands pressed flat over her ears, rocking very slightly, her eyes fixed on nothing. Near her, on the floor, lay a small wooden music box, lid open and silent, plainly broken. "Ilka," the boss said, and the change in his voice was so complete that Lynette barely knew it for the man who had just kissed her. What remained was helpless. The nurse straightened. "She will not be moved, sir." The noise from the hall. "I have tried everything." Lynette did not decide to step forward. Her body simply did it, the way it always did when the thing in front of her was frightened instead of watching her. "Turn the big lamp off," she said quietly. "Leave the small one. And everyone stop talking to her. She is not refusing you. She cannot hear you over her own heart, The nurse looked to Severin. Severin, to Lynette's surprise, nodded. The room dimmed. Lynette lowered herself to the floor several feet from the girl. Not close. Well outside the small kingdom the child had built for herself. Between the shelf and the stone. She did not reach for her, or say her name. She picked up the broken music box instead, turned it over, found the little comb of metal teeth inside, and with one fingertip plucked a single note from it. It rang flat and lonely in the quiet. The rocking slowed by a fraction. "That's a sad little sound, isn't it?" Lynette said. Not to the child exactly, but to the box. "Somebody dropped you, I think." She plucked the note again. She was not looking at the girl, which meant she felt, rather than saw, the moment those small fixed eyes moved and landed on her hands. "I know a song this box used to know," Lynette said. "It's older than the box. Older than me. My grandmother used to hum it when the wind came off the water and rattled everything that wasn't nailed down. And she hummed it. 4 notes, low and slow, then the same 4 again, softer. It was the tune she had carried out of her childhood into every bare, rented room she had ever lived in, the one that had steadied her own hands on nights when Emeric's voice was still loud inside her skull. She let it trail into nothing, and went on turning the broken box in her fingers, as though she had no interest whatever in the girl in the corner. A long minute passed, then another. A small hand let go of one small ear. Lynette did not react. She hummed the 4 notes once more. And the child, without seeming to decide it, uncurled by the smallest degree, and reached out and put 2 fingers on the edge of the music box, as if to feel whether the sound still lived inside it. "There you are," Lynette murmured. "You wanted to know if it was still in there." "So did I." Ilka did not speak, but she shuffled forward on the floor, out of her corner, until she was near enough that her shoulder came to rest against Lynette's arm, and there she stayed, breathing, listening, her fingers on the silent box and Lynette's low voice threading the 4 notes through the dark. Lynette looked up. Severin Callias was standing in the doorway, with the door frame gripped in one hand, and on his face was an expression she would spend a long time trying to name. It was not gratitude, it was closer to grief. He was looking at the child against her arm, as a man looks at a thing he had privately decided he had lost. The nurse whispered, "She has not let anyone near her since her mother." She stopped. Severin came into the room. He crouched, slowly, a careful distance away, and he did not command the girl to come to him, though Lynette could see how badly he wanted to. He only looked at Lynette across the small dark space. "My sister died last winter," he said very low. "Ilka has not spoken since the day of it. Doctors, specialists from the capital, a woman who charged a fortune to sit and stare at her, and nothing." He looked at the 2 fingers resting on the broken box. "You have been in this house 9 days. I've been in this room 4 minutes, Lynette said. His jaw worked. Outside, dimly, the party went on. 300 people, waiting for an announcement that would now never come. "The arrangement does not end tonight," he said. "I need you to understand that before you agree to anything. The Corte family came here, expecting to bind their daughter to me by dawn. When they learn there is a wife instead, they will start turning over stones, and the first stone they turn will be you. If they prove the marriage is a lie, they take their insult back with interest, and in my world that debt is never settled." Gently, he glanced at the child. "And they have never much cared who is standing nearby when it comes due." Lynette's mouth had gone dry. "And if I say no, then a car takes you to the station tonight, and you never hear the name Callias again." He said it flatly, and something in that flatness told her he expected her to take the car. She looked down. Ilka had tipped her head against Lynette's shoulder and closed her eyes. The small hand had found the cuff of Lynette's sleeve and taken hold of it, the grip of a child who has decided, without words, that this particular sleeve is not to be allowed to leave. Lynette thought of the envelope in the book, of the audition she was too afraid to book, of a man in another city who had taught her that her hands were not to be trusted with anything that mattered, Her hands were not shaking now. The contract, when it came, was 1 page, and cold as a blade, and Lynette read it twice at the long kitchen table of Callia's house, while the housekeeper pretended not to hover. The housekeeper was a broad, watchful woman named Helena, with flour permanently worked into the lines of her knuckles and an expression that gave away nothing until it decided to give away everything at once. She set a cup of tea at Lynette's elbow without being asked, and stood back with her arms folded. "He wrote you a marriage on a single sheet of paper," Helena said. "That is either the most romantic or the most frightening thing I have seen in this house, and I have been in this house a long time." Lynette turned the page over. It said what Severin had said it would. A wife in the eyes of the city, until the danger from the Corte family had passed, a room of her own, wages, discreetly paid. And a second clause, added in a hard slanted hand at the bottom, that had nothing to do with any of it. That Miss Vaughan's care of the child Ilka would be at Miss Vaughan's own direction, and that no method she judged harmful to the girl could be required of her by anyone in the household, the master of it included. "He added that part himself," Helena said, watching her read it, "in his own hand, after you had gone up to bed. He stood in this kitchen at 2 o'clock in the morning and wrote it, and would not say why." Lynette said nothing. She was thinking that a man could tell you a great deal about himself by the one promise he made that no one had asked him for. She signed. And then, because the clause about the child was the only part of the whole strange bargain she wholly believed in, she went to find the child. The music room was at the cold, northern end of the house, a long glass conservatory built out over the seawall, so that on 3 sides there was nothing but gray water and grayer sky. It held a piano. Lynette had seen it on her second day, and had walked past it quickly, the way a person walks past a door they are not ready to open. It was a good instrument gone neglectful, a fine old thing with a film of dust on its lid and one candle stub melted onto the frame, as though someone had once played it at night, and then, one night, had simply stopped. Ilka was brought to the conservatory the next afternoon and left at the door by the nurse in grey, who plainly expected the whole enterprise to fail and wished to be elsewhere when it did. The steward Dorian had drifted in as well, a narrow man with a clipboard and a low opinion of temporary staff, ready to report to whoever it was such men reported to. "She will not sit for lessons," Dorian said. "Better people than a caterer have tried, then she won't sit for lessons," Lynette said. "I didn't ask her to. She did not call the child in." She left the conservatory door standing wide, sat down at the neglected piano, with her back half turned to it, and did nothing at all for a while, but look at the water. Alka stood on the threshold in her small gray coat, the broken music box clutched to her chest, and watched. Lynette lifted the lid off the keys. She did not play a song. She pressed one note, a low one, and let it ring out across the glass room and die over the sea. Then after a moment the note a fifth above it. She was not performing. She was only asking the old instrument whether it still answered, the way the night before she had asked the broken box. Her hands, which had trembled over trays in front of 100 guests, lay on the yellowed keys as calm as two sleeping animals. She played the 4 notes of her grandmother's tune. Slow, bare. Then again, behind her, small feet crossed the threshold. Lynette did not turn. She played the 4 notes a third time, and left a silence where the fourth repetition should have gone. An open door of a silence, and into it, thin and uncertain and impossibly quiet, a child's voice hummed the 4 notes back. Lynette's hands went still on the keys. She did not let the child see her face, because her face had done something she could not control, and a frightened creature should never be shown that it has the power to break you. She breathed once, slowly. Then she answered the 4 notes with 4 more, a small phrase the tune had always gone on to, and an invitation rather than a demand, and Ilka, standing at her elbow now, hummed those back too. By the door, Doran had stopped writing on his clipboard. Lynette set the girl's broken music box on the piano's music stand, where a page of notes should go, and she picked out its old tune on the keys. One careful finger, and Ilka watched the hammers rise and fall inside the open instrument, as though she were watching the inside of a living thing. When Lynette reached the place where the box's mechanism was broken, where the melody had for months fallen off a cliff into silence, she did not stop. She simply played the rest of it, the part the box could no longer remember, and gave the child back the end of a song her mother must once have wound for her 100 times. Ilka put her hand flat on the wood of the piano to feel it sing. They stayed there until the light went out of the water. When Lynette finally rose, the child's hand found her sleeve again, that same fistful of cuff, and did not let go all the way to the stairs. Severin was waiting in the corridor. He had, she realized, been there for some time, out of sight, beyond the glass, standing with the particular stillness of a man who did not want to be caught listening. He looked at his niece's hand knotted in Lynette's sleeve, and then at Lynette, and for the second time in as many days. She watched the dangerous quiet of his face come undone at one corner. "She hummed to me tonight," he said. It was not a question, and it was barely a sentence. "I have not heard my sister's daughter make a sound in the better part of a year, and tonight she hummed to a woman she has known for one day." "I didn't begin with the thing that hurts," Lynette said. "That's all. When something is that frightened, you never begin with the thing that hurts." He was quiet a moment. "Is that a rule for children?" "It should be a rule for people," she said, and regretted how much of herself was in the answer. Something moved through his eyes that she did not have a name for and did not trust. He stepped back from it, deliberately, the way a man steps back from an edge. "Rest," he said. "Tomorrow the city begins to test whether you are really my wife." He turned to go, then stopped. "Miss Vaughn." "I did not know the house still had that sound in it." He left before she could answer, which was as well, because down in the great hall below them a bell had begun to ring, late and insistent, the sound of someone arriving at Callias' house who had not been invited, and Helena's voice floated up the stairwell, sharp with warning. "Sir, the court girl is at the door, and she has brought a man from the conservatory who says he knows your wife." Vesna Court crossed the threshold of Callias' house as though she had come to measure it for new curtains. She had changed out of the pale green of the gala into a coat the color of wet slate, and the cold off the harbor came in with her and did not quite leave when Helena shut the door. Behind her came a man Lynette knew. She knew him the way a person knows a face from a life they have folded up and put in a drawer. Tobias Wren was tall and a little rumpled, graying at the temples, carrying a soft leather case. He never seemed to set down. He had sat on the audition panel at the conservatory in the city. Lynette no longer said aloud. He had once, years ago, told a frightened girl of 19 that her hands were the most honest thing about her playing. He had not known her married name then. He did not know now that her married name was a lie. "Mrs. Callias," Vesna said, arriving at the foot of the stairs and looking up with a smile bright and precise as laid cutlery. "I told my father it was unpardonable to descend on newlyweds, but I could not rest until I had congratulated the woman who made an honest man of Severin Callias overnight." Lynette came down the stairs slowly, because slowness was the only thing she could be certain of. She felt the tremor waiting at the edge of her hands, the old familiar guest, and she did the thing she had learned to do with it. She looked not at the watching woman, but at the child asleep, upstairs in her mind, and her hands stayed where she put them. "You are very kind," Lynette said, "though I think honesty is a great deal to credit to a wedding." Most of it he managed on his own. Severin came into the hall, then unhurried, and put a hand at the small of Lynette's back, as if he had done it every evening of his life. It was for the room. She told herself it was for the room. "Vesna," he said, "and Wren, you keep unusual company for a Doc's family." "Dr. Wren is advising my father on the harbor concert," Vesna said. "A charity of mine, the arts." She let the word arts land on Lynette like a glove laid across a face. "He was telling me on the drive the most extraordinary thing, that he is almost certain he once knew your wife. In another city, under another name." The hall went very quiet. Helena by the door found something to do with her hands. Severin did not move, but Linnet felt the hand at her back go still and attentive, waiting to learn from her what the truth was to be. Tobias Wren looked at Linnet, and Linnet looked at Tobias Wren, and in the half-second before either of them spoke, a great many things were decided. "I said I was almost certain," Tobias said gently, "and I find I was wrong." He inclined his head to Linnet with grave courtesy. "The woman I knew stopped playing some years ago, walked out of a hall in the middle of a season, and was never heard of again. A loss to everyone with ears." He smiled. "But she did not have your eyes, Mrs. Callias. I apologize for the confusion. It is the curse of my profession. I meet 10,000 pairs of hands and forget every face attached to them. It was a lie, and it was a kindness." And Linnet understood in that moment that he had given her the choice of her own past, which was the one thing Emmerich Dane had never once done. Vesna's smile did not falter, but something behind it recalculated. She had come to catch a servant in a stolen dress. She had found, instead, a wife who was defended by a stranger. She turned the visit to pleasantries after that, sharp little pleasantries with hooks in them, and Linnet fielded each one. And twice, Severin finished a sentence Linnet had begun, and once Linnet finished one of his. And the terrible thing, the thing neither of them looked at directly, was how easily the halves fit. When at last the visitors rose to go, Tobias took Linnet's hand in both of his in the old formal way, and she felt a stiff edge of card pressed into her palm and closed her fingers on it without looking down. "A great pleasure, Mrs. Callias," he said. "Should you ever wish to hear the harbor concert rehearse, the door is always open to you. Some rooms are easier to breathe in than others. I have found music to be one of them." Then they were gone, and the cold went with them, and Severin shut the door with his own hand and stood a moment with his back to her. "He lied for you," Severin said. "Wren." "Why?" "Because he is a decent man," Linnet said, "and they are rarer than you are used to." Severin turned. In the lamplight, the careful stillness had cracked, and what showed through was not the boss and not the husband, but only a man looking at a woman he had known a matter of days and could not account for. "You could have let him name you," he said. "You could have handed me your true past like a card of your own and made yourself harder to send away. You did not." "Why?" "Because it is mine," Linnet said, "not a card to play." She held his gaze until it cost her, then looked away. "Good night." She went up the stairs with Tobias Wren's card burning in her closed hand, and only in her own room, with the door shut, did she open her fingers and read it. It was not the address of a concert hall. It was a line in his careful script. "A seat remains open. In the spring. Auditions. It was never yours to lose. Come and take it back." She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. Downstairs she heard Severin climb to the child's door and stand outside it, not going in, the way he did every night. Now, listening to make sure the small breathing was even, she heard him not knock, she heard him not enter. She heard him choose again to leave the frightened thing its room. And she understood that the lie she had signed was going to be far harder to survive than the truth had ever been. The house learned Linnet slowly, and then all at once. By the end of the first week, the shape of her days had set like cooling wax. In the mornings, she was the wife of Severin Callias, which meant she wore the good gray wool Helena had let out to fit her, and stood at the correct distance from her husband, while men with careful faces came and went through the eastern doors and said little, and was watched. In the afternoons, she was something the contract had a truer name for. She and Ilka went to the cold glass room over the sea, and the piano taught them both to breathe. The child did not speak. But she changed in the small ways that mattered. She began to bring things to the conservatory. A gray pebble, a gull's feather, the broken music box, always the box. She would set each offering on the piano lid and wait, grave as a priest, and Linnet learned to find a few notes for each one, a sound for the pebble, a lighter sound for the feather, so that the child understood that the woman was listening to the things she could not say. On the fourth afternoon, Ilka climbed onto the bench beside her and put one finger on a white key and pressed it and looked up. And Linnet did not applaud, because you do not applaud a frightened creature for being brave. She only found the note that lived beside it and let the two of them ring together, and Ilka pressed her key again and again, learning that a sound she made would be answered and not corrected. Severin began to appear at the edge of these afternoons. At first he had reasons: a paper to sign, a question about the child's supper. Then the reasons wore thin, and he stopped bothering with them and simply came, and stood at the glass with his back to the water and his hands behind him, and listened. He never asked her to play for him. She never offered. But she noticed that on the evenings he came, the deep line between his brows was gone by the time the light left the water, and she told herself she noticed it only as she noticed the weather. He sent her things. This was how men of his kind spoke, she came to understand, in objects too large to refuse. A coat of charcoal cashmere appeared across her bed one morning, and she folded it and had it returned to his study by noon. A jeweler came to the house uninvited, was given tea by a bewildered Helena, and was sent away again with his velvet trays unopened. On the 10th day, two men carried a crate into the conservatory and began, with apologies, to uncrate a new piano, a black lacquered instrument that had cost, Lynette did not doubt, more than every room she had ever rented laid end to end. "Take it back," she said. They looked at her, then past her, to where Severin stood in the doorway. "It is a better instrument," he said. "The old one is 30 years neglected. It will not hold its tune through a winter." "Then I will tune it," Lynette said. Ilka does not trust the black one. She has never heard it. She has decided to trust the old one because the old one was here when her mother was here, and it sounds the way her mother's playing sounded, and if you put a perfect new thing in this room, the child will simply stop coming. She held his eyes. "You do not replace the thing a frightened person has finally decided to trust. You keep it. You keep it even when it is worse than what you could buy." The crate went out again. That evening, when she came to the conservatory, the old neglected piano had been tuned, quietly, by someone he had sent while she was elsewhere, and a note lay on the lid in the hard slanted hand she was learning to read. It said only, "You keep it." She put the note in the book with the envelope, and did not ask herself why. She learned him in pieces, the way she had learned the child. That he read every letter twice when he was worried, and once when he was not. That he removed his heavy signet ring before he did anything real with his hands and set it on the mantel so that she could always tell, entering a room, whether the man in it was the boss or only Severin. That he had never been offered plain food and did not know what to do with it. That last she discovered by accident. On a night the kitchen was dark and Helena gone home, and Lynette, unable to sleep, went down and made herself the supper of her poorest years: brown bread toasted at the stove and a single fried egg and strong tea, and turned to find him in the kitchen doorway in his shirt-sleeves, watching her as though she were performing a rite from a country he had never visited. "There is a cook," he said. "There is, in fact, more than one cook." "I know how to feed myself," she said. "It is nearly the only thing I never forgot how to do." She looked at him. "There is bread enough for two, if you can bear to eat something no one arranged on a plate." He came into his own kitchen, like a man crossing a border, and sat at the scarred table where the staff took their meals, and she put a plate of toast in front of the most feared man in Saltmere. And he ate it. He ate all of it. When he was finished, he looked at the empty plate with an expression she could not read. "My sister used to cook," he said at last, very low. "Enoch. When we were young and had nothing." He did not say anything else. But he had said her name, which Lynette had not heard him do before, and she understood that he had handed her something, and that in his world things were only ever handed to people you had decided to trust. She should have said something kind. Instead, her hand reaching for his empty plate brushed the back of his, and neither of them moved it, and for the length of a held breath, the kitchen was very quiet and very warm, and the lie they had signed was nowhere in the room at all. Then a floorboard settled somewhere in the sleeping house, and they both drew back as though caught, and Linnet carried the plates to the sink and did not look at him. And Severin rose and said good night, in a voice gone rough at its edge, and went up the stairs alone. Linnet stood at the dark window a long while after, her hand still holding the warmth of the accident, and told herself, without believing a word of it, that it had meant nothing at all. The voice found her on a gray Tuesday, the way it had always found her, when she was least braced for it. The telephone in the front hall of Callia's house was an old black thing that rang rarely and never for her. She was crossing the hall with the child's washed coat over her arm when it rang, and Helena was at the market, and Duran was somewhere with his clipboard, and there was no one else. So Linnet lifted the receiver and gave the number the way she had been taught, and a silence opened on the line that she knew before a single word came. The particular silence of a man letting you understand he is in no hurry. "Hello, little bird," Emmerich Dane said. The coat slid off her arm to the floor, and she did not pick it up. Her legs found the small chair beside the telephone table without being asked. His voice arrived exactly as it had lived in her ear for years, low and warm and reasonable, the voice of a man who had never needed to raise it, because he had trained everyone around him to lean in. "You are hard to find," he said, "when a person wishes not to be found, but not as hard as you imagine. A name in a concert program, a seat held open in the spring auditions. Wren always did have a weakness for you. I hear things, little bird. I hear you have landed yourself something grand, a harbor, a house, a dangerous man." "Do not call me that," Linnet said, and hated that it came out small. He laughed, softly, pleased. She had forgotten how her fear delighted him, how it was the whole of the game. "There she is," he said. "I only wanted to warn you, since no one else will. Men like this one do not collect women like you for your conversation. You have never understood the difference between being wanted and being kept. You will embarrass him the way you embarrassed me, and when you do, he will not be as patient as I was." He let it settle. "Come home, before you break something that costs a life instead of a plate," she should have hung up. Instead, she let the old voice do its old work, felt her hands begin the fine tremor they had learned in his front room, felt herself become again the girl who dropped things and ruined evenings and turned simple happiness into an emergency. For a moment, the warm house went thin around her, and she was back in a hall in another city, walking off a stage mid-season, because her hands would no longer obey her while he watched. Then at the top of the stairs, a sound. 4 notes, low and slow, then the same 4, again. Elke, on the landing in her nightgown, humming to herself the tune Linnet had given back to her, humming it the way a child hums a thing that has become hers, without knowing anyone is listening. Linnet put the receiver down, not slammed. Set down, quietly, the way you close a door on a room you are choosing to leave. She went up and sat with the child on the top step and hummed the 4 notes until the tremor left her hands, and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that Emmerich Dane had never once made her hands go still. He had only ever made them shake. That was the whole of what he had been for. She did not hear Severin come in. She only became aware of him standing at the foot of the stairs, coat still on, cold still on him, looking up at the two of them on the step, and she understood from his face that he had heard the last of it. Not the words, the shape. "Who was that?" he said. "On the telephone." "No one," she said. And then, because she was tired of the word, because it was Emmerich's own word for everything that had frightened her, she said, "My husband. He found me through the auditions. He wanted to remind me what I am." Severin came up the stairs slowly and sat below them, 1 step down, so that for once she was the one looking down at him, and he did not reach for her, and he did not offer to solve it, and he did not ask the name, though she could see the name being written somewhere behind his eyes, in a hand that did not forget. "There is a thing I did when I was young that cannot be undone," he said, watching the child hum. "A man is gone because of me, and it was not justice. And for 11 years his voice has told me, Most nights exactly what I am. He looked up at her. You cannot make it stop, but you can stop letting it give the orders. The voice may stay in the house. It does not get to say who eats at the table. Lynette's eyes stung. It was not the polished comfort of a man who had never suffered. It was the rough thing itself. Hand it over. He wants me to be afraid, she said. It is the only version of me he knows how to keep. Then, he does not know the version. Who sat on my library floor and put my niece back together with a broken toy, Severin said. He rose. That one frightens me a great deal more than she frightens him. He went to look in on the child, and Lynette gathered the fallen coat from the hall below, and for a while the house was quiet. It did not stay quiet. Near midnight Anders came, Severin's right hand, a spare gray man who moved through the house like weather and spoke only when it mattered. Lynette heard the low voices in the study, and came halfway down the stairs before she knew she meant to, and caught the end of it through the not quite closed door. The court family has been paying for questions in the city, Anders said. About your wife, where she comes from, whether the marriage is what you say. And there is a stranger asking too, from out of the province. Southern accent, well-dressed, uses the word husband when he speaks of her, though he is not you. The line went silent. Lynette stood on the dark stair with her hand on the cold rail and understood that the two men who wished to own her, the one who wanted her afraid, and the one who wanted her gone, had begun, without knowing it yet, to look for each other. The harbor concert was held in the old customs hall, a great stone barn on the eastern quay that the Corte Charity had draped in white, until it forgot it had ever weighed fish. Half of Saltmere came. The other half sent someone to watch on its behalf. Lynette came on the arm of Severin Callias, in a gown, the color of deep water, and felt every eye in the room find her and file her away. This was her weakest ground, and she knew it. She could steady her hands over a frightened child in a dark room. She had never learned to steady them under a chandelier. While 300 people decided whether she deserved the name she was wearing. Vesnacourt had learned it too, and had built the evening around it. She let Lynette get one glass of wine into the reception before she struck. She crossed the floor in oyster silk, took both of Lynette's hands as though they were the dearest of friends, and turned, still holding them, to the room. "Everyone," she called in a voice trained to carry, "you must forgive me. I have kept a secret, and I cannot keep it another moment. Our own Dr. Wren tells me that Mrs. Callias is not merely the wife of the most private man in the city. She was once, in another life, a musician of rare gift." She let the word gift ring. And here we stand raising money for the harbor, with a great neglected piano behind us, and a genius pretending she cannot play it. She smiled, wide and merciless. "Play for us, one small thing. We would all be so grateful." The trap was perfect, and Lynette saw every tooth of it. Vesna had learned from Emmerich's world what Emmerich had done to her. A woman who had walked off a stage with shaking hands would shake now, before all of them. And the shaking would say what no rumor could prove, that she was nothing, that the marriage was a costume. That Severin Callias had reached into a catering agency and dressed up a wreck. The old fear came up through the floor and into her knees. She felt the tremor start. She felt 300 faces waiting, the way Emmerich had taught her to feel them, as judges rather than people. Across the room, Severin had gone very still, and she understood that he could not save her from this without proving her weak, that any hand he offered would only finish what Vesna had begun. Then, at the edge of the crowd, small and grave in a coat, too good for her, stood Ilka. No one had meant to bring the child. Halina, later, would confess she had not the heart to leave her crying at the gate. Ilka held the broken music box against her chest with both arms and watched Lynette across the sea of legs and gowns with the total patient attention of a creature who has decided that a particular person is the safe one in the room. Lynette stopped feeling the 300. She felt the one. She let go of Vesna's hands. She crossed to the great piano, and she sat, and she did not look at the crowd at all, because the crowd was not who she was playing for. She looked at the child, and she began, low and slow, 4 notes. Then the same 4 again, the grandmother's tune, the tune she had given back to a silent girl on a cold afternoon over the sea. She did not play it as a performance. She played it as a conversation. And halfway through the second phrase, small and clear and impossible, in a room full of the richest people in Saltmere, a child who had not spoken since her mother died opened her mouth and hummed the answering line. The customs hall went utterly silent. Linnet played on, gathering the little tune up into something larger, letting it climb and turn. And it was not the polished thing the conservatory had once tried to make of her. It was better. It was hers. When she lifted her hands from the keys, the silence held for one whole breath, and then the hall broke into a sound that had nothing arranged about it, and Ilka pushed through the forest of legs and climbed into Linnet's lap on the piano bench and put her face against Linnet's neck, and Linnet held her and did not once look up to see who was watching. She had spent her whole life terrified of rooms full of eyes. She understood at last that she had simply never before had a reason in the room worth more than the eyes. Afterward, in the crush of people who suddenly wished to be her friend, Linnet found Severin at the edge of it, watching her with an expression stripped entirely of its usual armor. Tobias Wren was beside her, delighted, saying something about the spring, about the seat, about the world she could still have. And Severin watched the doctor lean close to his wife, and Linnet saw the jealousy move through him plain as weather, and saw him choose not to hide it. "You should have that," he said, when Tobias had gone. "The audition, the season, all of it." He said it as though the words cost him. "You were made for rooms like this, when the room is yours." "And you," she said. "What were you made for?" "For emptying them," he said. He looked at the child asleep now against Linnet's shoulder. "I did not know, when I told you to pretend, what I was inviting into my house. It might have ended there, warm and open." The truest thing he had yet said to her. But Vesna Corte was not a woman who lost quietly, and she found Linnet alone at the cloakroom as the crowd thinned. And the friendliness was gone from her face, like a mask set down. "A pretty trick with the child," she said, low. "But I have been paying men to learn about you, Mrs. Callias, and they have earned their money." She stepped close. "There is a man in Saltmere tonight who calls himself your husband, and he did not marry you in this city, and he has not signed any divorce." She smiled, and it was a terrible thing to see. "So the question is no longer whether Severin lied to my father about a wife. The question is whether the wife is a liar and a bigamist, and that," she breathed, "is not a scandal. That is a rope. I only have to decide whose neck to hang it on." They did not speak of Vesna's threat on the drive back along the seawall. Linnet held the sleeping child, and Severin watched the black water, and the thing Vesna had put into the night sat between them like a third passenger. Only when Ilka had been carried up and put to bed, and Helena had gone home, and the great house had folded down into its late quiet, did Linnet find Severin in the conservatory. He had not turned on the lamps. He stood at the glass wall, with the harbor light strung out below him and his signet ring already off, set on the piano lid, so that she knew before he turned that it was only the man in the room. "She will use it," Linnet said. "Vesna, the first husband. She will use it to break you." "She will try," Severin said. It was not bravado, it was only fact. "Weighed and set down. Let me carry that one. It is the kind of weight I was built for." He turned. "You carried the other one tonight, in front of all of them." He shook his head slowly. "I have watched grown men face far worse, with less in them, than you carried to that piano." Linnet crossed the dark room. She was aware of every step, and of the fact that for once her hands were not shaking, and of the exact distance still between them. "The night you kissed me," she said, "you never asked. You took my face in your hands, in front of the whole city, and you decided, and I let you, because there was nowhere in that room to put a no." She stopped an arm's length from him. I have spent my whole life being decided for, by him. By that room tonight, by you. That first night, though, you meant it kindly. I know, Severin said quietly. I have thought about it more than you would believe. So this time, Lynette said, I am going to decide. She reached up and took his face in her two hands, the way he had taken hers, and turned the whole thing over, the whole strange bargain, so that for once the choosing belonged to the one who was always chosen for. She felt him go very still under her palms. His hands stayed at his sides. You can hold me, she said, if you would like to. But you will wait until I have finished deciding. I am waiting, he said, and his voice was not steady at all. She kissed him, and it was nothing like the gala, nothing like the performance he had staged for 300 witnesses. There was no room to sell it to. There was only the dark glass and the water and the old piano and the two of them, and when at last his hands rose, they rose slowly, asking the whole way up, and settled at her waist, as carefully as if she were something that might decide, even now, to change her mind and be let go. She did not change her mind. For a long moment there was only that, his careful hands and her chosen kiss, and the great bank strength of him held so deliberately in check that the holding was itself a language. She had been touched, most of her life, by a man who came into a room and made it his before he was well through the door. She had forgotten, or perhaps had never once known, that a man could pour his whole strength into not taking, and that this could be the most moving thing a body was able to do. When they parted, his forehead came down against hers, and they stood breathing in the dark, close and unhurried, the harbor lights swimming far below the glass. The doctor, he said against her hair, is going to be very disappointed. She laughed low and felt him smile. You are still jealous, she said. I am managing it, he said. She felt him smile against her hair. For a while neither of them spoke, and the glass room held the quiet. I spend my life keeping things, he said at last, very low. Ships, streets, debts, men to their given word. I did not know, until tonight, that there was a kind of keeping a person does with open hands. You are the first thing I have ever wanted to hold. That way. They stood a while longer. Then some old vigilance moved back into him. She felt it enter his shoulders, and he drew back far enough to look at her, and there was a thing in his face she should have marked more carefully than she did. I lost my sister to this city, he said. I will not lose you to it, whatever it takes. Whatever I have to do. Nothing in Saltmere is going to touch you now. He said it like a vow, and she heard the love in it, and let it warm her. She did not yet hear the other thing underneath, that a man who says nothing will touch you has already decided he alone will hold the door, and that the surest way to make a cage is to build it out of love and call the bars protection. The bad night came at the turn of the season, when the first true storm of winter walked in off the sea and the anniversary of a death walked in with it. Lynette did not know the date meant anything until the house began to change around her. Helena grew gentle and watchful. Doran, of all people, spoke in a hush. And Ilka, who had been climbing week by week out of her silence like a swimmer finding the surface, went back under. She would not eat. She carried the broken music box everywhere and would let no one else touch it. When the wind rose after dark and threw the rain against the tall glass, she began to scream, and it was not the held, drowning quiet of the first night. It was the full open terror of a child who has understood, on this night of all nights, that people can leave and not come back. Severin was in the nursery before Lynette reached it, and he was doing everything wrong. He had the lamps blazing, he was holding the child by the shoulders and saying her name, over and over, in the low, commanding voice that had bent grown men, and the child was fighting him, twisting away, shrieking into the storm. Turn the lights down, Lynette said from the door. Let go of her arms. She fell tonight, he said, and his own voice was cracking. She fell down the stair. She will not stop. I cannot make her stop. You cannot make her stop, Lynette said, coming in. That is the whole of it. Stop trying to make her. Sit down on the floor. I do not sit on floors. Then, your niece screams alone, she said. And she said it gently. And it landed like a slap. She watched the war move through him. Then the most feared man in Saltmere lowered himself to the nursery floor in the roaring dark, and the fight went out of the room a little, because the largest thing in it had made itself small. Lynette turned the lamp down to a coal. She did not go to the child. She sat on the floor, a careful distance away, and she began low under the storm. 4 notes, and then the same 4 again. She did not sing them at Ilka. She sang them the way you leave a lamp burning in a window, for whoever might be out in the weather and looking for a light. Put your hand flat on the floor, she said to Severin. Not on her. Beside her. Let her come to the hands, or not. It has to be hers. He laid his great hand on the boards. Lynette laid hers a little way off. And slowly, over long minutes, as the 4 notes went round and round and the storm spent itself against the glass, the child's screaming wore down to sobbing, and the sobbing to a ragged breathing, and Ilka crawled, not to her uncle and not to Lynette, but into the small warm country between their 2 hands, and gripped a fistful of each of their sleeves, and slept. For a long time, neither of them moved. The rain eased, the house ticked and settled. She died a year ago tonight, Severin said at last. So low it was almost the storm. My sister, Lynette said nothing. She had learned that the silence was the door, and you did not push on it. She was the only person alive who knew me before, he said, before the name, before men crossed streets to avoid me. We had nothing when we were young, and she fed us both, and she never once in her life was afraid of me. Not even at the end, when everyone else was. He looked down at the sleeping child between their hands. She married a soft, foolish, decent man, she had this one, and she made the single mistake of being my sister in a city where I have enemies, and one of those enemies could not reach me, so he reached her instead, on a wet street. In front of the girl, Lynette's throat closed. The child. She saw it. She saw all of it, Severin said, and then she stopped speaking, and no doctor in the country could find the words she had put down. He was quiet a moment. The court family did not do it. I want you to know that. It was another house since answered for. But it was the war that did it. My war. And when old Corte came to me with his daughter and his treaty and said, marry her and let us put the years of war behind us, I could not. Because to marry that peace would be to agree that Anike was a reasonable price. He looked up at Lynette, and his eyes were wet, and he did not look away from it. So instead, I stood in a ballroom and kissed a stranger with a tray of champagne, and told myself it was strategy. He gave a broken little laugh. It was not strategy. It was a man refusing, for once, to make his sister's death a bargain. Lynette reached across the sleeping child and laid her hand over his, where it rested on the floor. I stopped playing because a man taught me my hands were dangerous, she said. You stopped being a brother because a city taught you the same thing. She held his eyes. We are neither of us as dangerous as we were told. He turned his hand under hers so that they were palm to palm over the child, and they stayed like that until the gray came up over the water. He should have felt lighter. Instead, as the storm cleared, some iron thing was quietly setting in him, and she was too tired and too moved to see it. He had told her how he lost the last person who was never afraid of him. He had decided, somewhere in that telling, that he would not survive losing this one, and a man who decides that will do terrible things and call every one of them love. At dawn, Anders knocked, apologetic, gray, with a night of his own. There was a parcel left at the eastern gate, he said. No hand delivered it. Inside was a single photograph of Lynette and the child on the quay at the concert, and across the back, in a stranger's careful southern hand, 4 words. Whose wife is she? By the time Lynette came down the next morning, the house had already changed its shape, and no one had asked her. There were 2 new men at the eastern doors she did not know. The gate to the sea path, which had always stood open, so that she and the child could walk down to watch the boats, was chained. Her books had been moved from her own room into a windowless inner suite at the heart of the house, the safest room, Helena said unhappily, the one with no wall to the outside. And on the hall table, where the day's post always waited, there was nothing, because the post now went to Severin first. She found him in his study with the photograph on the desk and Anders at the window, and a decision already made in the set of his shoulders. "You are not to leave the house," he said, before she had spoken. "Not the grounds. Not for the child, not for the market, not for anything, until the man who left this is dealt with. The audition is finished. I have sent word to Wren that Mrs. Callias withdraws." He did not look up as he said it. It was too public. "It is how he found you. It is how they all find you. It ends." Lynette stood very still in the doorway. "You sent word to Wren," she said. "This morning." "You cancelled the one thing that was mine," she said. "And moved my room, and chained the gate, and you did all of it before I was awake." "I did it because there is a man in this city who wants to take you from me," Severin said. And now he stood, and the force of him filled the room, and for the first time since the courtyard of that first night, she felt the old animal part of her measure the distance to the door. "I did it because I will not be shown a photograph of the two people He stopped. His jaw worked. "I am trying to keep you alive." "I know you are," Lynette said. "That is the terrible part." She heard her own voice go quiet and level, the voice she used on frightened things, except that the frightened thing in the room was her. "Sit down, Severin. I will not." "You watched me," she said, not moving, "all these weeks. You watched me leave a door open for a child so she could choose to come in. You watched me refuse to drag her, refuse to lift the leg that hurt, refuse to put a perfect new piano where a frightened creature had decided to trust an old one. You saw that the whole of it, the entire art of it, was that I never once took the choosing away from her. She took a breath, and the moment you were afraid, you took mine. Every door in this house, my room, my name in Wren's book. You took them all before I opened my eyes, and you have the gall to call it keeping me alive." "This is different," he said, and it came out rough. "That is what he said," Lynette said. "Every time. That was his word. Different. His reasons were always special. His fear was always the urgent kind. His hand on my life was always the loving kind." She watched the word land on him and saw with no satisfaction at all that it wounded him exactly where she had aimed. "You told me a voice does not get to say who eats at the table, but you have just decided alone who I am and where I sleep and what I am allowed to want. That is not a table, Severin. That is a leash, and I have worn one. I know the weight of it to the ounce." Silence. The photograph lay between them on the desk, the child's face and hers, and the stranger's 4 words. "Do not," Severin said, and there was something almost pleading in it now. "Do not compare me to that man." "Then do not do the thing he did," she said, "and dress it in a better coat." For a moment, she thought it might reach him. Then the fear won, the fear he had carried up out of a wet street a year ago, and he played the one card she could not have survived him playing. "The child needs you," he said. "Ilka, you would leave her too, over a chained gate. Over a room without a window, you would break the one heart in this house that broke already." The room went very cold. "You swore," Lynette said, and her voice at last was not level. "You wrote it in your own hand, at 2 o'clock in the morning, that no one in this house would use a method against that child that I judged harmful. And the very first time it costs you something, you pick her up and swing her at me like a hook." She was shaking now, but not the old shaking. This was clean, and it was rage, and it did not spill a single thing. "You would teach her that love is a rope you get pulled by. I will not help you do it. Not to her, not to me." She saw the words, "Go home." She saw the exact moment he understood what he had done, and the horror of it, move across his face, and his hand come up, as if to take the sentence back out of the air. "Too late. I am ending the arrangement," she said. "The 7 days?" he said hoarsely. "The notice. It was for employment. This was never. My leaving does not require notice," she said. "That was the whole of what I came here without and found." She took the key to the inner suite from her pocket and set it on the desk beside the photograph. "Have Anders drive me to the tram. One man. He turns around the moment I am out of the car." Every part of him refused it. She watched him refuse it, then, because whatever else he was not. In the end, Emmerich Dane, he closed his eyes and gave the one thing she had asked for. "One man," he said. "He turns around." She went up to pack the little that was hers. She did not say goodbye to the child, because she could not have done it and still walked, and because the cruelest thing of all, the thing she carried down the stairs and out the chained gate and into the gray morning, was that leaving him meant leaving the girl. And there was no version of the right thing that did not also break something that had already been broken once. She took a room above the bakery on Founders Lane, 3 flights up, with a slanted ceiling and a window that looked over the tram wires to a wedge of the harbor. It was small and cold, and the whole of it smelled of the ovens below, and the key hung on a string around her neck, and it was hers, and no one had chained the door. Tobias Wren found her a week later, not to press her, only to say that the spring seat had not been given away, that a withdrawal sent by a husband was not a withdrawal signed by the pianist, and that the panel would wait. She sat with that a long time. Then she took down the one book she had never let another soul see her open, and drew out the envelope, thicker now than it had ever been, and counted what 9 days of champagne and a winter of wages had built. And she walked to the conservatory and put her own name back on the list in her own hand. The tremor came. She played through it. Tobias, listening from the back of the empty hall, did not say a word when she finished, which was how she knew it had been enough. She built the days one at a time, the way she had taught a child to build them. Mornings, she cleaned the bakery in exchange for the rent. Afternoons, she practiced in a cold rehearsal room the conservatory let her use. Evenings she was alone, and the aloneness was hard, and she did not pretend otherwise. But it was her own aloneness, and not a thing arranged for her by a frightened man. And that made all the difference. Severin did not come. This surprised her more than his coming would have. She had braced for the car on the lane, the men at the door, the flowers too large to refuse, the whole heavy apparatus of a man taking back what he had lost. None of it came. What came, once, was a letter, in the hard slanted hand, and it did not argue and it did not beg, and it did not once mention the child. He wrote that he had watched her leave a door open for a frightened thing so that it might choose to enter, and that in his fear he had gone through every door in her life and locked it, and told himself the locks were love. He wrote that they were not. He wrote that her belongings and her final wages were with Helena, whenever she wished to send for them, with no man attached. He wrote that the audition was hers, that he had written to Wren, to withdraw her only to make her stay, by shrinking her world to his own size, that he had since written again to unsay every word of it, that the seat had never once stopped being hers to take, and that he was ashamed. He wrote that he would not contact her again, unless she asked him to. He did not sign it your husband. He signed it only Severin, the man, without his ring. She read it more nights than she would admit. She did not answer it. What she could not have known, 3 flights up over the bakery, was what the letter had cost, and what was happening in the house on Cormoran Head. Ilka had gone back under, and this time all the way. She did not hum. She did not carry the box to anyone because the one person she had carried it to was gone. She sat at the cold glass over the sea in front of an old piano no one now played, and she waited, in the flat, patient way of a child who has been taught by the worst teacher there is that the people you love walk out into the weather. And Severin, who could have ended it in a moment, who had only to send a car and a photograph of the grieving girl and a single line, "She misses you, come back," did not send it. He sat with the child in the evenings, the two of them, and the silent instrument, and he did not turn her grief into a hook. He had done that once. He had swung the child at the woman he loved like a weapon, and watched it break something in them both. He would not do it again, not even to bring back the only thing he wanted, because somewhere in the wreck of that morning, he had finally understood the lesson she had been teaching him all along, without his noticing. That you do not drag the frightened thing. That love which takes the choosing away is only fear wearing better clothes. That the door has to stay open, even when the cold comes through it, even when no one walks in. He handled the man from the south and the daughter from the west by his own means, quietly, without touching her name, and he told no one that the house had gone silent again, and he waited at doorways he would not go through. It was Helena who broke. She came up the 3 flights on a Thursday evening, breathless and gray, and stood in the doorway of the little room with her hand on her chest, and Lynette was on her feet before a word was said. Because you learned to read a face like that. The child, Helena said. Ilka. She looked everywhere else and could not find her. Lynette, she is gone. She waited until the house slept, and she took her coat and the broken box, and she went out the gate he unchained for her, and no one saw which way, and it is dark, and it is nearly freezing, and she is 6 years old, and she has only ever loved 2 people in this world. Helena's voice broke apart. He is out there now with every man he has. But, Lynette, if she is going anywhere, if that child has a place in her head she is walking toward, she did not need to finish it. Lynette was already reaching for her coat. The conservatory rehearsal room was the only place in Saltmere that Ilka had ever seen Lynette outside the house. Lynette had taken her there once, on a bright afternoon in the thaw, and let her sit under the piano while Lynette practiced. And the child had put her hand flat on the wood to feel it sing. It was the only map the girl had. It was 3 miles across a cold city from Cormorant Head, and a child on foot would go the long way. By the lit streets, she knew, by the tram wires, down to the water. Lynette did not go to the conservatory. She went to the harbor, to the stretch of quay below it, because a frightened creature does not walk toward a building. It walks toward the last place it felt safe, and the last place Ilka had felt safe was a bench above the water. On the night, a whole hall went silent to listen to her hum. She found her there. The child was a small dark shape at the end of the quay, sitting on the cold stone with the broken music box in her lap, her coat too thin, her lips going blue, looking out at the black water with the terrible patience of the abandoned. She was not crying. That was the worst of it. She had stopped expecting to be come for. Lynette did not run the last of the way, though everything in her wanted to. A child at the edge of deep water is not a thing you rush. She slowed, and she came along the quay unhurried, and when she was near, she sat down on the cold stone a little distance off, the way she had that first night in a lamplit library, and she did not grab, and she did not scold, and she did not say the girl's name. She hummed 4 notes, low and slow, then the same 4 again. The small dark shape went very still. Then, worn and cracked, and impossibly quiet, out of a child who had not spoken a single word since a wet street took her mother a year and more ago, came a voice. You came, Ilka said. 2 words, the first 2 words in a year. Lynette's whole chest broke open around them, and she still did not lunge. She only opened her arms and left the choosing where it belonged, and the child crossed the last cold stretch of stone on her own 2 feet, and climbed into them and held on. And Lynette wrapped her coat around the shaking little body and pressed her face into the cold hair and let herself, finally, weep. I came, she said. I will always come. You do not have to walk out into the weather to be found. Do you understand me? You only have to wait, and I will come to you. She did not hear him arrive. She only became aware of him, the way she always had, a stillness at the edge of things. Severin stood at the head of the quay, where the stone met the street, close enough to see that the child was alive, and in warm arms, and no closer. His men were behind him, held back with one lifted hand. He had run, she could see it. The ring was not on his finger and his coat was open to the cold, and his face was wrecked, and he stopped, at the edge, and he did not come and take them. "May I?" he said. It was all he said. His voice would not carry the rest. Lynette looked at him across the cold quay, the man who had once taken her face in his hands in front of the whole city without asking, who had chained a gate and moved her room and swung a child at her like a hook, and who now stood 10 feet away in the freezing dark with his hands empty at his sides, actually waiting. To be told. The whole story was in that waiting, the entire distance he had come. "You may," she said. He crossed the quay slowly and lowered himself to the stone beside them, not reaching, and only when Ilka turned and put one hand out to him did he gather the two of them in, carefully, as a man holds a thing he has learned he can lose. The child kept one fist knotted in Lynette's coat and one in his, binding them, the pack she had chosen for herself, out of a broken world. "I sent no car," he said against Lynette's hair. "All these weeks I wanted to send 1,000. "I know," she said. "That is why I am sitting here, and not somewhere else. I handled the man from the south," he said, quietly. "In the doing of it, I learned what he used to call you, and he will not call you little bird again, in this city or any other, and no one was harmed for it. And Corte, there is no treaty, and there is no daughter, and there is no threat, because I stopped fighting the war that took my sister, which is the only thing I could give you. That cost me the way, keeping you would have cost me." He drew back to look at her. "Everything I own I would have put in front of you and called it love. It took losing you to learn that the only thing worth giving is the thing you cannot buy back. The choice. I am done deciding for the people I love." Lynette held the child between them and looked at this dangerous, ruined learning man. "I will take the seat in the spring," she said, "on my own name. And I will keep the room over the bakery, because it is mine, and a person should always have a door only she holds the key to keep it," he said, and she heard, under the two words, the note he had once left on a piano lid. "Keep all of it. And I will come to the house," she said, "because that child is mine now, in every way that is not on any paper, and because the man who lives there leaves doors open." She let it rest, the way her grandmother had taught her to let a note rest, so that the ear leaned in and had to wait. "But I will come, because I choose it, not because you built a world too small for me to go anywhere else." "I know the difference now," he said. "You taught it to me with a broken toy on a library floor. I was only slow to learn." The tide moved against the quay. The child had fallen asleep between them, one small fist in each of their coats. Far up the hill, the house on Cormoran Head stood with its gate unchained. He had once whispered to a stranger with a tray of champagne, "Pretend you are my wife tonight," and kissed her before the whole watching city to save himself. Now the most feared man in Saltmere sat on a cold stone quay, with his ring in his pocket, and his hands open, and waited, and asked, and let a woman who had spent her whole life being decided for, do the last of the deciding. She leaned across the sleeping child, and she kissed him, because she chose to. And there was no one at all watching, and it was the first thing between them that had never once been pretend.